want to say Shalom Aleichem, Shavua Tov. And we are on page Chaf Daled in the introduction to Kodshim. And we were talking about Lishma in the Avodas HaKarban. And the last thing that we discussed, just to review it, and then I'll show you where we're starting today, is that there are four avodos: Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. And the Machshavos HaPoslos, which we'll see fit into one or two categories, either Shinui Kodesh, he had in mind the wrong Zevach, or Shinui Bailim, he had in mind the wrong person for the Bala Karban. All that applies during the Avodos for the purpose of Zrika, meaning that he had in mind at the time of the Shechita that he would do the Zrika on a different Karban or on behalf of a different Bailim. So that's called Machsheve Shelo Lishma HaPoseles. And we set up, again, just to review, Karban Pesach and Chatos as unique Karbanos in the constellation of Zvachim, whereas in other Zvachim, other than these two exceptions of Chatos and Pesach, the law is that the Karban is kosher, despite the Shinui Kodesh or Shinui Bailim, but Eino Ola L'Baim L'Shem Chova. In the cases of Pesach and Chatos, the Shinui passes the Karban. Now, the last thing that we discussed on Yom Chamishi was that there are, there's Ruvain, Shalom Aleichem Ruvain, long time no see. There are certain Karbanos that, according to certain Tanaim, have the same status, that unique status, as Pesach and Chatos, where Shelo Lishma completely disqualifies, undermines the Karban. For example, Rabbi Eliezer adds Asham to Chatos, because according to Rabbi Eliezer, at the beginning of Masechet Zvachim, there's a striking similarity between Chatos and Asham insofar as both Chatos and Asham come to be mechaper on an Avera. And therefore, in both those cases, we have halacha of Shinui Posel. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer, the logic that compels Rabbi Eliezer is don't limit yourself to a Karban Chatos, include an Asham as well. Ben Azai wants to add an Olah, that in the case of a Karban Olah, if he has a Machshevet Shelo Lishma, that passes the Karban. That's because Olah is always considered more chamur, and the standards and the requirements of Olah are always greater than those that apply to other Karbanos. So if in Chatos, for example, Shelo Lishma passes the Karban, how much more so in an Olah, Shelo Lishma will pass the Karban. And then we have the sheet of Yossi ben Choni. And what he wants to do is, he wants to apply the halacha of Shinui Posel to all Karbanos in the cases of L'Shem Chatos and L'Shem Pesach. So it means that any category whatsoever of a Karban, according to Yossi, if he has in mind L'Shem Chatos, that will passel the Karban. And that's a pretty far-reaching statement, because it means that even in a Karban Shlomim, you could have a Shinui that passes the Karban. If, let's say, the Kohen Oved, who is being makar of a Karban Shlomim, has in mind L'Shem Chatos, Shlomim L'Shem Pesach, L'Shem Chatos, then according to Yossi, the Karban is possible. So that Chatos and Pesach are unique in both directions. Number one, if he's being makriv a chatos and he has in mind l'shem ola, etc., that passes the korban. And number two, if he's being makriv even a korban shlomim, but he has in mind l'shem chatos, that passes the korban. And finally, we ended last week with Shimon Achi Azariah, and Shimon was of the opinion that it all depends on namuch and gavoah, that we divide up the Kodshim into two categories. There's the lower category, which is called Kodshim Kalim, and the higher category, which is Kodshim. So if he has in mind from namuch to gavoah, then the korban is kosher. If he has in mind gavoah down to namuch, so he's shechting Kodshim, and he has in mind Kodshim Kalim, that's going to passel the korban. And we mentioned that there is a psul of shinui, machsheves shinui, that's chal, even during shchita, kabbalah, and holacha. If during any one of those three avodos he has in mind that he's going to be zorek the dam, l'shem bailam acherim, shinui bailim, that's going to passel the korban. However, if he has a machshevet shinui bailim in any of those avodos, for the sake of that avoda, let's say, for example, shchitas shlomim of Ruvain, he has in mind to be zarek the dam l'shem Shimon, that's going to passel the korban. Well, again, in shlomim, it'll be Eino Olo L'Bayil L'Shem Chov. In any event, but if he has in mind that the shechita of Shalmei Ruvain, he's implementing the shechita L'Shem Shimon, that's not a machshava poseles. The machshava poseles in Shini Bailim always has to be related to Zrika, because what's unique about Zrika as opposed to the first three avodos is that the Zrika sets up the kapara of the korban on behalf of the Bailim. So that Shini Bailim means that he has in mind that the Zrika, which is made to generate the kapara for the Bailim, is not being done for the sake of the Bailim that's Ruvain, but rather for the sake of someone else that's Shimon. And this led us to a discussion about L'Shem Chulin. Now, intuitively, you and I would have said that if he's shechting a zevach, L'Shem Chulin, how much more so should that be a machshava poseles? And yet, paradoxically, it works in just the opposite direction. A machshava L'Shem Chulin, because again, shchita is common to both Kodshim and Chulin. It's the same identical shchita. He has in mind on this zevach that he's shechting it for the purpose of Chulin. It doesn't passel the zevach. We can still apply the principle of staman lishma. And why is that? Because Chulin is out of the league. It's out of the constellation. A psul of machshava has to be something similar to what the Torah demands. It's l'shem zevach, but the wrong zevach. L'shem zevach, but the wrong bailim. Instead of Reuven, he has Shimon in mind. But at least he's shechting kodshim. He's shechting a zevach. When he has in mind l'shem chulin, that doesn't register at all. That's like if he had in mind for the purpose of an elephant. You know, he's doing the avoda for an animal. So shachat l'shem chulin, again, this on page Chav Daled. By the way, I'm now the proud owner of a scanner. We just have to set it up. So once we get this set up, I hope to be able to scan the text for you in case you don't have a Mesifta on Zvachim, which has this long introduction to Kodshim. So he says that Shachat L'Shem Chulin Ein Zu Machshava Shelo Lishma Poseles, even in the case of a Chatos. So he shechts a Chatos L'Shem Chulin. And we said that in Chatos, everybody agrees that a Machshava of Shelo Lishma passes the carbon. And certainly here he had a Machshava Shelo Lishma. He was L'Shem Chulin. Doesn't pass the carbon. The Mina Machriv Ba, Belav Mina Lo Machriv Ba. It's out of the league. It's not in the constellation. It's not Mina. It's not Me'ein HaKarbon or Me'inyan HaKarbon. And it's like a non-entity. It doesn't even register. Nevertheless, as far as in a positive sense being a chatos, in other words, there are two different dimensions here. One dimension is whether it's a zevach. And the second dimension is whether it's that specific zevach that has a particular purpose and a goal. So in the case of chatos, I have to address two different questions. Number one, is the carbon kosher? And number two, is it a chatos that's mechaper and olo l'baylim l'shem chova? And here's where we're going to make a split. If the kohen or oved shechts the carbon l'shem chatos, then it's kosher. If he shechts the carbon l'shem chulin, then it's kosher, but it's not a chatos. It's not olo l'baylim l'shem chova. Okay, now we get into the issue of shlomim. Shlomim breaks down into many subcategories. For example, there's a carbon toda. And he shechted the shlomim for the purpose of a carbon toda. But it's not a carbon toda. So on the one hand, he has the advantage that toda is a shlomim. Toda is one subcategory of the generic category called shlomim. But on the other hand, carbon toda has its own dinim. For example, a carbon toda is generated by a chiyuv hoda in 4 different categories, arba tzrichim lahodos, and a carbon toda requires the accompaniment of 40 lechamim, of 40 loaves of bread, 30 of which are matzah and 10 of which are chametz. So the halacha is that it depends which direction you're talking about. Chishev v'carbon shlomim l'shem carbon toda, that's a shiri kodesh. But chishev v'carbon toda l'shem shlomim ain't zu machsheva shiri kodesh. Meaning, in one direction, we're okay. We could be machshe the carbon. He had in mind when he shechted the toda l'shem shlomim. That doesn't undermine the carbon because the toda is in fact carbon shlomim. It's nechal abaylim. It's eaten b'chol ha'ir. All the dinim of shlomim fundamentally apply to carbon toda. But if on the other hand he shechted the carbon shlomim l'shem toda, that's already a machshava poselos, because the unique dinim of toda did not apply to a shlomim. So whereas toda is included in the generic category of shlomim, but the case of shlomim does not include toda because the unique hakrava of a carbon toda. Now, what happens in a case where Reuven brings a carbon toda, and the Kohen has in mind Shimon? That would certainly be a psul of Chini Bailim. However, what happens if both Shimon and Reuven are both obligated to the carbon toda? When he shechted the carbon toda of Reuven, he had in mind l'shem Shimon. He made a switch. He says the following. Listen carefully to the very subtle distinctions here, nuances. Haya l'Reuven carbon toda, l'Shimon carbon toda. Chishev b'shchitas karban toda shel Ruvain, shu shochto l'shem karban toda shel Shimon. Do you hear the language clearly? He had in mind l'shem karban toda, but not for the toda of Ruvain, but rather for the toda of Shimon. If he just would have had in mind a shchita for the purpose of Shimon, but he has in mind l'shem karban toda, that's a different story. But that's not the case we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a case of chishev shchita l'shem Shimon, but rather chishev l'shem karban toda shel Shimon. And the question is this a machsheva shinui kodesh? On the one hand, it's kind of a shinui kodesh because he has in mind for the carbon of someone else. But on the other hand, it's not a shinui kodesh because they're both the same category of a carbon toda. So in the case where he has a machshava l'shem Shimon, so that clearly is a shinui bailim. I mean, it's a shinui aposel. But he's makari v'sarachokim, so to speak, because he had in mind l'shem toda shel Shimon. So he's already on the way to the proper lishma. He hasn't stepped out of his bounds to a different category of a zevach. He's within the same category of a zevach, namely karban toda. So that's a machlokes in the Gemara in Zvach Madaf Zayin Amanal. Nechleku Amoroim. Ihavi machshevet shinui kodesh. Sharei chishev bo l'shem karban shel acher. He had in mind Shimon, and that makes it into a shinui kodesh. Oh, the other man, the Yomer in the Gemara says that ein zu machshevet shinui kodesh kevin shemachshavto hoisa l'shem toda. But also sug karban. It's the same category of a karban. So this is a sugya on Daf Zayin. Now, according to one man biyom, as we said before, since he has in mind l'shem todas Shimon, that's already considered a shinui kodesh. Now let's jump to other karbanos. Shochat es hakarban l'shem karban chavera. Let's say both Reuven and Shimon are bringing a karban chatos. Let's say Reuven has his obligation to bring a chatos and Shimon his. And the Kohen had in mind l'shem chatos of Shimon. And that itself could be considered a shinui kodesh. So now let's just think it out. What's the difference between shinui kodesh and shinui bailim? I mean, after all, even if it's the same kodesh, meaning the same zevach, but he had in mind for another bailim. And a machshava of Shinui Bailam itself is a machshava poselis. So why are we racking our brains to figure out whether the Shinui Bailam in this case is upgraded to the status of a Shinui Kodesh? For that, we'll have to backtrack a little. And you'll see on the right column of page Chaf Daled, the Mirz Hashem will try to make sure that you have that text in front of you. I know that John, I think, has it. He says the following. Machshevet shalom lishma haposelis yesh ba shnei ofanim. Shinui kodesh, hainu shechishev ha'oved b'shas ha'avoda, she'ose kein l'shem karban acher, kigon, chishev b'shchitas ha'shlomim, shu shocheres ha'karban l'shem chatos. So there's no relationship to Zrika. It wasn't that he had a machshav at the time of the shchita that it'll be zorek the karban l'shem chatos. He had in mind that he's shechting the karban l'shem chatos, and that already comes under a machshavet shalol l'shma poseles on the Shinui Kodesh. In contrast, Shinui Bailim, hainu shechishev ha'oved bizrikas ha'karban, sha'oses hazrika l'shem Bailim acher, kigon chishev ha'oved bizrikas ha'shlomim shel karban shevi Ruven, shu zorek es hadam l'shem Shimon. So that in Shinui Bailim, everything depends upon the zrika. And if you hold that mechashvim me'avoda le'avoda, so then even if he has in mind the first three avodos for the purpose of the zrika with a Shinui Bailim, that would constitute Shinui Bailim. But the bottom line is that Shinui Bailim is on the zrika, where Shinui Kodesh applies straight across the board, even to the other avodas. So he checked it l'shem Shinui Kodesh. That means Shlomim l'shem chatos, and that already constitutes a Shinui Kodesh. So just again, jumping forward to our point from before, the issue is going to be in Shar Karbanos, that if he has in mind l'shem karban chavero, that might itself constitute a Shinui Kodesh, which would therefore be a machshava poselis in all four avodos. Whereas if we're going to say that since he had in mind l'shem Shimon, let's call him, of a Shinui Bailim, but it's in the same karban, like the case of Reuven and Shimon that are both chayav a karban toda, and we said that possibly that's not called a Shinui Kodesh because whether it's Reuven's toda or Shimon's toda, it's all the same karban toda. So that could only be a psul under the category of Shinui Bailim, but not under the Shinui Kodesh. Whereas according to the other opinion that we mentioned, if he has in mind for the toda of Shimon instead of the toda of Reuven, that itself is a Shinui Kodesh. And therefore the chumrah of Shinui Kodesh would kick in. And that might apply in all karbanos. Okay then, so let's now learn a little bit of Yavam. So I just want to make a note here of where we got up to. We're at the top of Daf Chaf Hey. Then Mirz Hashem will pick up on Monday.